So our third speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Emmet O'Connor, who's going to talk about republicanism and the changes that occurred in republicanism and indeed the left generally in from the 50s onwards.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak. I've decided to address the question of whether the civil rights movement was a communist conspiracy, and it was characterised as such by the Stormont Minister of Home Affairs, William Craig, who was he got himself a reputation as a hardline unionist, and he made a remark in the early 70s saying that time is approaching when he must be ready to shoot to kill, and after that he was known as Shoot to Kill Bill. So he described the Civil Rights March on the 5th of October 1968 as an omnium gathering of members of the Londonderry Housing Action Committee, the majority of whom were also members of the Connolly Association, of the Republican Party, which includes well-known members of the IRA and Sinn Féin, of the Young Socialists and the Communist Party. He also claimed that the march posed a threat to the US naval base in Lough Foyle, and said that the RUC believed the civil rights movement was a Republican front. Now, these remarks were obviously a caricature, but they did contain a grain of truth, because it wasn't just one civil rights movement. Very often people think that the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, NICRA, was the civil rights movement. But there were lots of associations before that, and it was really a kind of a tendency or a movement in a very broad sense that had many different aspects to it. Some people were in it just for jobs and houses and a fairer society. Others wanted revolution and a 32-county socialist republic. So why did Republicans and Communists get involved with the civil rights movement, and where did it take them? To begin with the Republican movement, after the Civil War in 1923, the IRA survived as a small underground army of a few hundred members, but its military record was poor and confined in practice to occasional actions rather than sustained campaigns. But that changed in the 1950s. The IRA got lucky. Normally, Irish public opinion reflects international trends, but in the late 40s, as Europe was sort of moving away from nationalism after World War II, there was a brief reversion to traditional nationalism in Ireland. And in a way, it was the sort of final fling of middle-class nationalism in the Republic of Ireland. Various policies on partition had been tried since 1923, and it was still regarded as unfinished business. After World War II and the redrawing of the map of Europe, all of the constitutional nationalist groups and all of the parties in Dáil Éireann mounted a major diplomatic and public relations offensive on partition under the title of the Anti-Partition League. So it was against that backdrop that the IRA started to recruit some very talented cadres. And the failure of the Anti-Partition League, which kind of more or less sort of petered out and ran into the sand into the early 1950s, confirmed a lot of people in the IRA that only military action would work. And they pulled off a major arms raid on Gough Barracks in Armagh in 1955. And Sean Cronin, who was he was an ex-Irish Army officer, later on became Irish Times correspondent in Washington, D.C. He drafted this Operation Harvest, which is more usually known as the Border Campaign. The strategy was to fight a guerrilla war like the flying columns during the War of Independence. Volunteers were to wear uniforms and to comply with the Geneva Convention. They were to engage the British Army only and avoid contact with the RUC or the B Specials so as not to be drawn into a sectarian conflict. They were also instructed not to become active in Belfast for fear of provoking retaliation. So the idea was that these flying columns would create liberated areas, and that in turn would internationalise the problem and bring Britain to the negotiation table. The Border Campaign began on the 12th of December 1956. It involved an impressive number of actions, but it failed to win much support in the north. Most of the volunteers were from the south, and Northern nationalists regarded it as something which was imposed on the North from the South. So as early as 1959, the campaign started to fizzle out, and when it was called off in February of 1962, most people didn't realise it was still on. It had entailed the death of 6 RUC men and 8 IRA volunteers. The humiliation of the border campaign led the Republican movement to a complete rethink. And nationalism generally, as Eamon Phoenix has alluded to, was in an existential crisis at this time. And there's a growing consensus that the national question needs to be put on the back burner. The IRA was demoralised. The Nationalist Party had run out of ideas. It complained about discrimination, but it proved incapable of mounting a campaign on civil rights. It was against cross-border cooperation because it believed this would normalise partition. Its policy was to look to Dublin for help, but plainly that was bringing no results. Efforts were made to replace the Nationalist Party with an organisation called National Unity in 1959, with the National Political Front in 1964, and the National Democratic Party in 1965, and these also failed. Many people felt that nationalism itself had failed, and because of things like the welfare state, it was a difficult time to argue for Irish unity. In 1960, average income in Northern Ireland was about 30% higher than in the Republic. The healthcare was much better, the welfare benefits were higher, and it was believed that the education was better. Personally, I'm not sure about that, but certainly it was cheaper. So, after Sean Lemass replaced De Valera as Taoiseach in 1959, he turned his back on traditional anti-partitionism. Now, Lemass has been much acclaimed for this, and you can see there the hagiography of Lemass in 2015. They brought out this stamp to mark the 50th anniversary of the Lemass-O'Neill meeting, and Lemass has been praised, indeed T.K. Whitaker also, for the meeting with O'Neill. But the flip side of that was that Lemass turned his back on the Northern Nationalists. In 1962, he was advised by the Irish Department of External Affairs that pressing the British on discrimination was the obvious way forward in Northern policy. And he said, no, we're not going to try and undermine the Stormont government, we're going to work with it. Eddie McAteer and the Nationalist Party were told to get into Stormont and become the official opposition. This was a tactic they tried before, and it had led to nowhere. Also in 1964, RIARC, the company that basically the sort of Catholic Church company, did a lot of film documentaries, and they did a documentary on gerrymandering in Derry, and Lemass had it banned from RTE. He said, I'm trying to get a meeting with Terence O'Neill, and this sort of thing is not going to help. So it wasn't shown on RTE until 1988. Lemass got his meeting with O'Neill in 1965. It was the first time that the two prime ministers in Ireland had met since 1925, and everything started to look rosy. Lemass proposed 17 areas of cross-border cooperation, and the only change O'Neill made to the list was to add 2 more areas. But the level of cooperation was slight, and Catholics were expected to put up with discrimination while the two governments got on with swapping paintings in museums. The hagiographies of Lemass and Whitaker forget that not since the Civil War in 1922 had nationalists north and south been so much at odds, and this would make it impossible to prevent events in 1969 veering towards extremes. Lemass and then his successor Jack Lynch, they were hopelessly uninformed about what was going on in Northern Ireland and completely unprepared for what happened, particularly in August 1969 when things started to turn very violent. And again, it's something which is simply not alluded to. Lemass is much praised for being far-sighted in his northern policy, but really the policy was a failure. Now, meantime, left Republicans had formed the Wolfe Tone Directories to prepare for the bicentenary of the birth of Wolfe Tone in 1963. Their purpose was not just to organise commemorations, but to look afresh at how Republicans could unite Catholic, Protestant in the centre and break the connection with England, the two most famous quotations from Wolfe Tone. The directories led to the foundation of the Wolfe Tone Societies, which aimed to be both agitational and directional. And the guru of the Woolstone Societies was Roy Johnson, who was himself from a Northern Protestant background and a Marxist. Johnson was one of those arguing that Republicans needed to get involved with social struggle. At the time, he was a scientist. He was working with Aer Lingus and later Trinity College, and he was inclined to take a technocratic approach to politics and social change and see them as issues that could be resolved and directed in a scientific way. Johnson was close to Anthony Coughlin and Desmond Greaves, and all of the three were linked with the Connolly Association. The Connolly Association had originated with left Republicans in London in 1938. In the 1950s, it was more or less allied to the Communist Party of Great Britain. Greaves was a member of the CPGB, but most of those in the Connolly Association were not. And the CPGB wasn't entirely comfortable with the Connolly Association's priority of rallying the British left behind the demand for a united Ireland. Some felt that they should prioritise socialism before nationalism. From 1955, Greaves persuaded the Connolly Association that the best way to undermine unionism was to focus on civil rights. The Connolly Association also pioneered the civil rights tactics of pushing on the civil rights abuses in Northern Ireland and lobbying Labour and Liberal MPs and organising marches. In 1965, Greaves suggested to Betty Sinclair and Bill McCullough, who were secretary and chairman of Belfast Trades Council, and they were both in the Communist Party, which will tell you how influential Belfast Trades, or how representative it was of the trade union movement in Belfast at the time. They persuaded him that the Trades Council should hold a conference on civil rights, and that conference took place on the 8th of May, but it came to nothing. Now, Greaves would later argue that this was a major error. He argued that had the largely Protestant-led trade union movement at the time led the campaign for civil rights, it would have been seen as a class movement rather than a Catholic movement. And he blamed the Northern Ireland Civil Rights, the Northern Ireland Labour Party (NILP) for its fear of having anything to do with the civil rights movement or with the national question. Even at this stage, the view has grown up among Protestants that civil rights meant Catholic rights. Now, Greaves was right in theory, but he was also offering a counsel of perfection. The idea that Belfast Trades Council was representative of the labour movement in Belfast was a bit misleading. I mean, it really hadn't been representative since the Third Home Rule crisis in 1912, by which time a lot of Protestants had more or less dissociated themselves from the Trades Council. It's true that most union officials at this time were Protestant, but the Protestant working class made it clear in 1912, in 1920, and again in 1974 that they would accept unions on issues of wages and conditions, but not politics. By now, civil rights groups in Northern Ireland were gaining traction. The Homeless Citizens League in Dungannon had led to the formation of the Campaign for Social Justice in Dungannon in 1964. And the Campaign for Social Justice saw that one simply couldn't assume that everybody accepted that there was discrimination in Northern Ireland. You had to make the case factually and produce statistics and so on. So they produced this researched pamphlet called Northern Ireland, The Plain Truth. In England, the Campaign for Social Justice worked with the Connolly Association, and together they contributed to the creation of the Campaign for Democracy in Ulster in 1965 by Manchester Labour MP Paul Rose. At its height, the Campaign for Democracy in Ulster had the support of about 100 Labour Party backbenchers. And it was powerfully boosted by the election of Gerry Fitt as Westminster MP for West Belfast in 1966. Fitt was an Irish Republican, but like many working class people of that generation, he had this very romantic view of the great British labour movement, which had brought the New Jerusalem in the form of the National Health Service, free education, better housing, better social welfare, full employment, etc. And he proved to be very effective in canvassing support on the Labour backbenches. Labour in Belfast moved hesitantly towards taking up the civil rights agenda. In 1966, the Northern Ireland Committee of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions and the NILP underwrote a joint memorandum on citizens' rights demanding electoral reform, representation for minority groups and public bodies, and measures to diminish, it's interesting to use that word, diminish discrimination in employment and housing allocation. And also they demanded an ombudsman. After the government met the NILP and Northern Ireland Committee deputation in 1967 and denied the existence of discrimination, the matter was allowed to rest. So again, you had the problem that Labour didn't want to push its members too far. The most famous civil rights movement was the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, NICRA, founded in January of 1967. The idea of a public campaign for civil rights had been raised at a conference of the Wolfe Tone Societies in Mahara in August 1966, and this led directly to the formation of NICRA. The first executive of NICRA had 14 members. 3 were communists. Others came from the Wolfe Tone Societies, the Republican clubs, the Ulster Liberal Party, the National Democratic Party, the Republican Labour Party, Jerry Fitz Group, the Northern Ireland Labour Party, the Ardine Tenants Association, and there was even a young unionist. But there was a lot of debate as to whether it should take to the streets. By now there was an awareness of Martin Luther King and the Black Civil Rights Movement. I'd have to disagree with previous speakers about the impact of the Black Civil Rights Movement in the US, inspiring the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland. I mean, there were movements underway before that, but nobody wants to say, I was inspired by Harold Wilson. Instead, people would rather say, I was inspired by Martin Luther King. In fact, Eamon McCann says in his War in an Irish Town that people were joining the NILP branch in Derry out of admiration for Harold Wilson. And he has a footnote, and down at the bottom of the page he says, this was possible. To my mind, the election of a Labour government in 1964 did a lot more to get the civil rights movement going in Northern Ireland than the Black Civil Rights Movement in the US. Although Labour didn't have a great record in Ireland, people believed that there was a point to getting involved with civil rights once the Labour was in power. And people, no matter how aggrieved people feel, they're not going to take to the streets or do anything about it unless they feel that there's a point to protest. They have to feel that protest is going to lead somewhere. And with the election of a Labour government and developing these channels of communication with the British Labour Party, they did feel that things could be moving or made to move in the right direction. But certainly by 1968, people were being inspired by the Black Civil Rights Movement. 1968 throughout the world was a year of protest. And in consequence of what was happening, people felt maybe it's time to take to the streets, because after all, there had been these movements around for the past 5 or 6 years, and they didn't seem to be getting far. And you could argue that unless they did take to the streets, they would still be labouring away in obscurity. But Betty Sinclair, among others, argued that Northern Ireland was different because marching in Northern Ireland implied this territorial ownership, which wasn't really the case in the United States. So she argued that a civil rights march in a Protestant area was bound to be provocative. Others said that the whole point of the movement was to break the sectarian mould, to show that they weren't a Catholic civil rights movement, that they were a civil rights movement for everybody. But the reality was that street protests produced this toxic chemistry of police and loyalist collusion that would ultimately confound NICRA's political project. When the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Movement was invited to a second march by the Derry Housing Action Committee, the apprentice boys declared their intention to walk the same route at the same time, switching a traditional morning parade to the afternoon. Both marches were then banned. NICRA actually hadn't understood the political geography in Derry. They didn't realise that Catholics were not supposed to march within the walls. But significantly, John Hume also opposed the march. He believed that it would be provocative. But the Derry activists insisted that it should go ahead and should not accept the government's implications that civil rights were Catholic rights. The 5th of October march changed everything. Under pressure from the British government, O'Neill conceded 5 of the 6 NICRA demands, and these were an end to gerrymandering, legislation against discrimination, a point system for housing allocation, repeal of the Special Powers Act, and disbandment of the B specials. The one demand he could not agree to was one man, one vote. And basically his problem was here in Derry, because that would mean loss of control of the corporation to the nationalists, and the local unionists would not agree to it. Moderates then agreed to a 1-month suspension of protests, but the People's Democracy, which had been founded after the Civil Rights March on the 9th of October, mainly by students of Queen's, determined to push on towards revolution as they saw it. And on New Year's Day 1969, the PD set off from Belfast to Derry on a long march in imitation of Martin Luther King's Selma to Montgomery march. The march led to the Loyalist ambush at Burntollet and the creation of the first no-go area in the Bogside. It led to a police riot in the Bogside, and that in turn provoked the creation of a no-go area. No-go meant no-go to the RUC. So the nationalists were now in revolt. This was exactly what the communists didn't want. Their strategy was to work patiently and build Protestant support for a class movement. Sinclair and Greaves were bitterly critical of Eamon McCann and the People's Democracy for pushing protest into what would be inevitably a sectarian conflict. In February 1969, 2 PD leaders, Michael Farrell and Kevin Boyle, were both elected to the NICRA executive in an effort to promote unity. Both at the time were Trotskyists. Now, the Trotskyists have their virtues, Goretti, but unity and patience are not among them. And the PD was even more critical of NICRA in consequence of the election of Farrell and Kevin Boyle. And it led to a lot of bad blood. And Mrs. Sinclair in particular was very bitter about it. She resigned from the executive in March of '69. The PD then later disaffiliated from NICRA. Some Republicans, notably Roy Johnson and the Wolfe Tone Society, share the communist belief in what became known as a stages theory. That is, the analysis that one needed to build class unity around civil rights and social issues in the first instance before raising the national question. However, there were others who saw evidence of a growing communist influence on Sinn Féin and felt it was taking the movement away from its core aim of defending Catholic areas and achieving a united Ireland. The violence of the 14th, 15th of August took everyone by surprise, and it cracked the state along the sectarian fault line. The Republican movement then split in December and January into the officials and the provisionals. The provisionals bombing campaign began in 1971. Like every IRA campaign since 1921, it ended in defeat, and anybody who thinks otherwise is deluding themselves. The officials came to define themselves in opposition to the provisionals, and by the 1980s it seemed that they were willing to work with anyone from the Northern Ireland office to Kim Il-sung in North Korea to prosecute their obsession with the provost. NICRA came under stronger communist and official Sinn Féin influence and became increasingly marginal as an organisation. Finally, some points in conclusion. Last October, Radio File published a series of recollections of Derry people on the 5th of October march, and it was easy to distinguish the Catholics from the Protestants. You know, even after all this time, that hasn't changed. All of the Catholics were consistent in their views. Things were bad, injustices were real, the civil rights movement was necessary and inevitable, and it did much good. Few connected the civil rights movement with the IRA or socialism or the flight of Protestants from the city side. Protestants, on the other hand, were very divided in their recollections. Some said injustices existed, others denied it. A common observation was that things were just as bad for working class Protestants, though why this should be an alibi or an excuse for doing nothing was not explained. Some saw the civil rights movement as a good idea initially. Most believed that at some point before the 5th of October, on the 5th of October or later, it was taken over by Republicans or subversives out to destroy the state. An implicit theme in Protestant recollections, and something not appreciated by Catholics, is that while Protestants were critical of big house unionism and the Fur Coat Brigade, they regarded an attack on the state as an attack on themselves, and they felt the claims of the civil rights group were a slander on the Protestant people. And I was very struck by that only last October here in the Guildhall when we had Erskine Holmes, who was on the Civil Rights March himself and later became head of the Housing Executive. And at one point he virtually exploded and he said that slogan, one man vote, one vote, that was a lie. I don't know what he meant by that, it was a fact. But clearly he did feel, this is insulting me and my people, and he had problems with that. Almost all Protestants made the connections with the Troubles and the polarisation of society, and most felt that all in all the civil rights movement wasn't worth the trouble that it caused. One must conclude that while the civil rights demands were justified, and this is evident in the fact that the demands were conceded by the British government by 1971, the aim of achieving cross-community solidarity behind reform has been a complete failure. Finally, I mentioned Desmond Greaves' Council of Perfection to Belfast Trades Council in 1965. It's one of numerous such councils, all of which were nice in theory but never worked in practice. One of my favourites is from Ernest Blythe, an Antrim Protestant who later became Vice President of the Irish Free State in the 1920s and a fascist in the 1930s. Blythe advised Catholics to join unionist parties and only form a nationalist party when certain that at least 1/3 of members would be Protestant. It's a nice idea in theory. Another is Roy Johnson's belief that if the Provost hadn't emerged, as he said to me, we'd now be home and dry. Others blame the People's Democracy March or blame Ian Paisley for things going wrong. But there are those who say it was hopeless, that Northern Ireland was just too divided. And maybe it's time to conclude that Northern Ireland is irredeemably sectarian, and the only way to get rid of sectarianism in Northern Ireland is to get rid of Northern Ireland. Or maybe it's just time to conclude. Thank you.